Hi everyone, I am Gautam Chakrapani. So I wanted to discuss about this open source compliance. So this topic, I wanted to start with the introduction, as many people doesn't know what is open source compliance or do not have the hint on what is open source compliance. Okay. So let's start with our topic. So before going into what is open source compliance, here we wanted to know what is open source software because that leads to this open source software compliance, right? So in terms of to know what is open source software is nothing but the source code that anyone can inspect, modify, enhance, and distribute the software back to the community or use that as part of the commercial software as well. So here in this sense, why open source software is kind of creating issues when it is going to be the commercial software is because the open source software is free and it is available to view the code, do the modifications, and you can distribute it back. But it comes with the open source software license terms and conditions, which needs to be obliged by an individual or the organization which is using this particular software into their development environment. Okay. So I'll go to the next slide. So which is open source compliance, which is our topic. So here, as we got to know what is open source software, how it needs to be managed inside the organization. So when we talk about the management, this open source software compliance process comes into picture. Now, open source software compliance is the process by which the users or the integrators or the developers of this particular software should observe the copyright notices, okay, and satisfy license obligations of that particular open source software which they are trying to use in their product actually. Okay, so basically this open source compliance software satisfies or achieve four main objectives for any individual or the organization. So it helps us to comply with the open source licensing obligations, and it also facilitate the effective use of open source in the commercial products, and also it helps us to comply with third party software supplier contractual obligations, that is in regards to see like any kind of obligations is there when integrating the open source software with the third party commercial software. Okay, and also it protects the proprietary IP which the organization wants to use this open source software in their commercial product. Okay, so, what leads to open source compliance and why this topic becomes so hot from the year 2007? It's not specific actually, but in India, it started the buzz from 2007 that each and every software organizations from level 3 to level 5 started to look into this particular compliance activities. Based on my experience, I'm giving this input. So basically, what leads to actually? So when as all we know that the software is developed now is kind of a multi-source development model, because software is not developed under one particular location and only by one particular people or the one particular group. So it means like the software development is kind of a distributed environment, that is like the development is being distributed across the globe wherever the organization having their regional offices, right? So now, for example, if you take the organization which is having the development running in three different locations, which is Bangalore, Cupertino, and Romania. Now, the software is not being developed at one particular location. It means like one module is developed in the Bangalore, the other module is in Cupertino, and the other module is in Romania. And now, when this region specific development is happening and it is distributed, and the goal remains the same or the requirements remains the same, that is, the software applications need to be developed. Now, Each team tries to develop a proprietary content, and they need to look into the faster time to market. So that means like who comes first wins the race. It's some kind of things, right? So now all the things are focused, or all the development focused towards the market. Who comes first wins a lot of opportunities, right? So in terms of that, when the development is happening, the developers are tend to look into the open source community to look and get a kind of a more matured software package to be used directly into their development in order to reduce time frame. So they start looking into the open source community, and they try to satisfy their requirement by looking into the open source community softwares, right? So they do that. So then from there, the software application is being developed with a combination of all these three categories, that is the proprietary, the open source, and from third party suppliers, so to or integrated into the software application, and it is being given to the resellers or the wares or the OEMs, etc., and it is being distributed directly to customers or through resellers to customers, right? So this leads to the non-trackable of the source that is being developed in a multi-source development or a distributed environment where there is no control. Now this leads to some kind of compliance issues, that where this code came from and how it is being integrated into the code, which requirement satisfies it, right? Until or unless the developer who develops it gives the details. Now this leads to open source software compliance in the enterprise, to make sure like which part comes in and which part is being given by the supplier, which part is developed by the organization, and how it needs to be encapsulated in terms of making sure the compliance of all the licenses are obliged, and making sure like there is no kind of lawsuit will be there when it is being distributed to the resellers or to the customers. Okay, so this is the problem statement which leads to open source compliance, and how organizations started looking into this open source compliance in the organization. And why? So all this time now we talked about what is open source software, what is open source compliance, and why open source compliance, or what leads to the open source compliance. Now let's see like why open source compliance is mandatory for the organization. Okay, so this is in regards is because like it requires the organization or the commercial entity to make sure like they protect their intellectual property and they secure their software products, right? Think tank, right? So if they want to do that, then they need to know the difference of what is coming into their product and what is their IP that is being integrated with the open source software. Because as I stated earlier, this open source software is free, but it comes with the license obligations with its terms that needs to be obliged by the user or the organization. Okay, so now this open source components is subject to license obligations, as I said earlier. In order to avoid risk of non-compliance lawsuits from OEMs or customers which is using it, then we need to do this open source software compliance. Okay. Now everyone got to know, or we tend to know that what is open source software, what is OSS compliance, what it leads to, and why it is required, right? So now, how it can be achieved in the enterprise or the organization. So as you see in the left side, you see the content. What you see here is like the development lifecycle model, which is develop, test, build, SEA, deploy, and maintain. So this SEA is the concept which needs to be integrated into the build environment to make sure like our software composition analysis is happening, and we derive the open source software components or the packages that is used in the software, and how we can look into the licenses and create an obligations to comply with the license terms that is being provided or integrated into our software system. So this can also be achieved by automating this analysis within the CI/CD pipeline. So it makes the automation of the build process easier, and during the build itself we can make sure like which part of our software is having higher complexity and license terms which cannot be used in a commercial product. So we can make sure like the released software is compliant with all the open source license obligations if we follow this OSS compliance in the enterprise. Yeah. So far, we have seen like what is open source compliance and how it can be achieved in the enterprise by using software composition analysis tools, and how we can automate it as part of the CI/CD pipeline. Okay, so why this need for software licensing and compliance is kind of mandatory, and each and every organization is looking for this. Is because each and every software that we download from the open source community and integrating into our product, it comes with a term called the copyright, and each software is under a copyright notice and an ownership rights that is been mentioned by the owner of that particular software, developed and distributed to the open source community, right? So this software is coming to the open source community is because the contributor thinks that the knowledge what he has shouldn't be a closed one, so it should be an open one, so that everyone can look into this and improve it much better than what his thoughts or requirements he had when designing and developing that particular software. So it's a kind of a global mindset that leads to this software to be in an open source community. Now, the copyright owner wants to have the users to have some kind of terms and conditions needs to be obliged when his or her software is used in a commercial software, or it is being used as a derivative work, right? So they wanted to keep track of their copyright notices intact with their publications that they have made. So this makes the need for this software licensing and compliance when it comes to the in a kind of an organization's perspective to be in a commercial product owner, and they wanted to commercialize the product. This need of our software licensing and compliance is very much mandatory. Okay. Now, so as we have seen, like why it is mandatory. Now, what will be the consequences of the non-compliance we will face during this setup? Is because each license comes with its own terms and conditions that needs to be obliged by the consumer, and it when it is going to be a commercial product, it needs to be carefully validated and give the credits to the copyright owners from whom this particular software is being integrated into one commercial product. Okay, so what can all be the consequences if we are not obliging or complying with the license terms that is being provided in the license of that particular package? Is sometimes it may lead to the product recall and make everything to the open source project, and needs to be published into the open source community. This is based on some kind of non-permissive open source licenses. We can discuss this in the separate video. So in this case, like the next consequence is like loss of money, actually. Okay, or the monetary benefits that the organization can get out of that particular project as a commercial solution. So we lose this if we are not following any kind of license terms and conditions. Then the loss of IP, actually. So the kind of integrations from a non-permissive license to one proprietary software leads to the opening of the code base to the public community, and making the IP to be open, right? We cannot claim the rights on our IP as well, because it is an infringement that we have made on the particular license which we use. And also this doesn't leads to the kind of product recalling or the loss of money, or the kind of loss of IP, but also it leads to the damage of the organization name and the goodwill what it has been developed so far in the a number of years the organization was in the business, right? So this all this kind of consequences happens if you are not following the open source software license terms and conditions, and the complying with the terms and conditions before we release the product as a commercial product into the market. Okay, so we need to keep all this in mind. So this open source software compliance is necessary, and it needs to be followed by the each and every organization which is in the business, and they wanted to commercialize their solution into the market. They need to go into this open source compliance process and make sure like their IP is are saved and protected, and the goodwill of the organization is saved because of complying to these licenses, and also making sure there is no loss of money and loss of IP by following this open source software compliance. I would like to end here with this topic as an introduction, and yeah, thanks a lot for your patience and looking into this video, open source software compliance in the enterprise. Thank you.